I say rock to the rhythm, but don't stop. 'Cause get a funk's got beat, short shot. I say rock to the rhythm, but don't stop. Get a funk got beat, short shot. I say rock to the rhythm, but don't stop. 'Cause get a funk's got beat, short shot. I say rock to the rhythm.
Okay, in this video, I will be discussing what happens to the market as supply and demand change. We have established in the course how we arrive at an equilibrium, price and quantity, and we found that this occurs at the equilibrium between supply and demand. Now, we don't expect supply and demand to remain in any given position over time. In fact, we expect supply and demand both to shift for various reasons. And so in this video, what I will be explaining is how we show a shift in either the supply or demand curves, what this means, and what this does to equilibrium values of price and quantity. Now, if you look at this graph here on this first page, we can see the historic price of a barrel of oil over time. We can see that for the most part, oil has been very volatile, say for the period of about the early 1900s to the 1970s. But as we can see, it's very volatile now as well. And the interesting thing about supply and demand is, as simple as it tends to be, we can use it to basically explain why oil has moved the way it has, and it does quite well. The theory holds up to the empirical data when you actually look at oil prices. So anyway, let's get started. Alright, and to wrap up the video, I wanted to show you how we can use simple supply and demand to show, in fact, a real-world price change. And in fact, in this particular supply and demand curve, I'm going to show you two price changes. So for right now, let's look at this pre-1999 supply and pre-1999 demand and the equilibrium that they form. We have an equilibrium pre-1999 quantity and an equilibrium pre-1999 price. And we don't need to put actual prices or actual quantities here. We can see what the demand curve would tell us what happened, and then we can sort of check this with the real world data. And so what happens between 1999 and 2000 is that globally we see a large increase in the demand for oil. As globalization and as sort of the relative affluence of the 1990s is spread around the world, we see a rather large increase in the demand for oil. So there's more cars being made, so we need more oil for more gasoline. There's more production globally, which obviously requires oil. We're shipping more goods around, both with land freight as well as air freight as well as sea freight, all of which involve oil. And so there was a pretty dramatic increase in demand over that time period. And if we look at the prices for oil at that time, we do see a pretty steady increase of price between 1999 and 2007. So during this time, we see an increase in price due to an increase in demand. So from around 1990 to 2007, demand increases steadily. During this time, due to various reasons, the supply curve, or the supply of oil rather, stays remarkably the same. This is largely because of the control that Western oil companies as well as OPEC have on the entire oil market. So basically, they spent a lot of the 80s and 90s extracting a lot of oil, and then in the 2000s they sat on that oil for a while, and so the supply of oil remained the same. Now we can see why they might want to do that. So if they keep supply of oil the same, then they can take advantage of this increase in demand, because now people are paying a higher price for oil, and so they're selling more and at a higher price, and so they didn't have much of a reason to increase supply. Okay, so now the second change happens from 1999 to 07 to 07 to 2014. And we can see the change here comes from a shifting out and to the right of our supply curve. So between 2007 and 2014, we see a pretty dramatic increase in the supply of oil. And this happens for two reasons. First off, because of concern over funding of terrorism and various other national security concerns, the U.S. starts really extracting its own oil. So we see large increases in oil extraction in the U.S. We see large increases in oil extraction in Canada, as well as off the shores of both Canada and the United States, as well as increases in the supply of oil coming from OPEC countries. In fact, if you can recall, last year there was in fact what we call a price war for oil. What we mean by a price war is that both Western and OPEC oil companies were pushing the supply of oil out. And as the supply of oil increases, what this causes is a reduction in price. So we can see that the price of oil falls from its 2007 price down to here in 2014. And this was due to both Western and OPEC oil companies increasing their supply. Now we call it a price war because both of them were pushing the supply out, and the price was falling. And as the price begins to fall, as we can see here, this means that oil companies are making less money. And this is something that normally we, as oil companies, would not want to do. But because Western oil companies felt they had quite a bit of market power, they felt like they could keep pushing the supply out, keep pushing the price down. OPEC thought the same thing. And as a result, we saw oil prices fall very low. In fact, quite low, quite lower than we saw in 2007. And so we actually saw a 2014 oil price that was quite low. Now, since then, we've seen the price of oil rebound quite a bit. But that maneuver, first from 1999 to 2007, and then from 2007 to 2014, can be completely shown in a very simple supply and demand curve. And then we can check this with the data, and we can in fact see that from 99 to 07, we saw an increase in the price of oil, and then from 99 to 2014, we saw a decrease in the price of oil. And we'll probably see these shifts over time. Again, the price of oil is quite volatile, so we can expect it. Now, it's important to remember that these are sort of average moves. And what I mean by that is that, in fact, if you go back and look at the data between 2007 and 2014, you'll see the price of oil rises over that time period. And we could draw even more supply curves to sort of reflect that. And so when I say from 2007 to 2014, I really mean sort of where we ended up eventually. So at the end of 2014, we have supply of oil really far out, and the price of oil was quite low by historical standards. And now one other point I want to make that I forgot here was that you may ask yourself, why does demand stay relatively the same from 99 to 2007, and then after that sort of remain there? And so what we mean by this is that from 99 to 2007, the demand curve shifted up, and then from 2007 to 2014, basically the demand curve stays the same. And the reason why was because of the recession. So because of the global recession in 2000 that began in 2007 through 2008, 2009, the demand for oil just basically sort of stayed the same. And what I mean by that is population growth over that time dictated more goods be purchased, but because the global demand was sort of on a hiatus because of the recession, it sort of made it appear as if demand just sort of remained there over time, when in reality it was just sort of an example of a lot more people, but a bad economy sort of keeping demand from increasing as we would expect it to do if there hadn't been, say, a recession. And so the reason why demand sort of stays there is because of the recession. And then what we are seeing recently, sort of after this particular graph, is in fact that the price of oil is now increasing again, and this is largely because of the demand side. So the supply side has been pulled back a little bit, so OPEC and Western oil companies have ended the price war, and we're seeing supply now being restricted a little bit, so the price of oil is rising as the supply shifts back into the left. And also at the same time, we see demand increasing for oil, because as the global economy starts to improve a little bit, starts to heat up, especially due to the American economy, then we expect demand for oil is going to increase. And so this is why you've seen the price of gasoline increase recently, and that's why the price of gasoline was lower last year, was because of that price war, and that's why the price of gasoline rose very quickly from 2000 to 2007, was because of the supply and demand for oil. And so we can always sort of turn to supply and demand to give ourselves rough estimates of what we think are going to happen to price and quantity. And again, despite its relative simplicity, we find it to be a very useful way and correct way often to think about markets.
I say rock to the rhythm, don't stop. 'Cause got a funk's got beat, so shot. I say rock to the rhythm, don't stop. shot.